Welcome to Radioactive Magazine. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're joined tonight by Matt Wechsler, director and writer of The Right to Harm, an award-winning 2019 documentary. Hi, Matt.
How's it going?
Oh, I'm doing well. Can you just give us an overview of your film?
Absolutely. It's really an environmental injustice look at how large factory farm-like animal operations affect the community members that live around them, and specifically rural community members who are more or less disenfranchised. And it's something that's happening all over the country. And in the film, we look at 5 different areas of the country where it's happening, that kind of explore the problem manifesting itself in different ways.
So your film is kind of focused on CAFOs, on concentrated animal feeding operations. That's basically a legal term that describes a building with 1,000 or more animal units inside of it. Just in general, why are CAFOs specifically a problem?
Well, CAFOs are a problem because it's a factory-like condition that has a biological output. It has waste. Any factory might have inputs and then may have externalities that come out of those inputs of what's produced. You know, in a coal burning factory, you might have massive plumes of exhaust that would pollute the air. In this case, with factory farming, you have the feces from the animals that has to be pooled into large lagoons, as they're called in the industry. And these lagoons could be up to 70 million gallons worth of animal feces that sits in anywhere from a 3 to 5 acre plot of land, where it is then moved via dump truck vehicles and spread onto neighboring rural land. And from there, it ends up in the water supply of nearby neighbors. Some of it is released into the air. And there's a number of studies that have shown a lot of toxic airborne chemicals, such as ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, that find their way into the lungs of nearby residents. So it's trespassing is the main issue. It's environmental trespassing of these toxic chemicals through the water ways and through the air to these rural neighbors. Currently, most of these CAFOs are protected by these laws that are called right to farm laws. And that's why the film itself is called Right to Harm. It's a play off that, as those who are affected by this in rural America, when they go to these public meetings to speak about this, they say, I don't think this is a right to farm. I think this is a right to harm. And that's really where we came up with the title of the film.
Tell me more about this right to farm legislation. I mean, what's the roots of that? What does that protect?
Well, agriculture has always been an industry that has had additional smells to it, additional nuisances, I guess you would say, in the form of odors or in the form of noise. And so there was a time when the industry was first kind of getting bigger in the 1960s and 70s, where there was a need for these industries to really be protected from their neighbors, so that they had the ability to continue to operate and produce food. The problem is that each of these right to farm laws are governed at the state level, and states can do whatever they want in terms of changing those laws over the course of time. And since they were first introduced in the 60s and 70s, they have really been changed by lobbyists for the industry, who are specifically looking to ease the regulations for what they're doing. And in many cases, these facilities do not fall under regulations for the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. They're able to operate outside of those regulations, despite the fact that they may have the same volatile chemicals that are coming off their facilities that a power plant would have, or that a landfill would have, or something else that would require very specific zoning. So that's kind of in a nutshell what that's all about.
So these CAFOs, these commercial animal feeding operations, they're kind of bypassing normal pollution controls because they have a right to farm that was designed for the small family farmers, but now we've increased to, very large scale factory farming, which obviously has a much larger impact. Is that kind of a good summary?
Absolutely, and they don't have to abide by a lot of regulations. They don't have to measure certain levels of toxins, either in the air or in the water, that other industries might have to do.
Obviously, there's a lot of waste that comes from it, particularly when we're talking animal farming, primarily here, agricultural, and livestock and such. I mean, large amounts of that's going to produce a large amount of waste, as you said. And I understand, I mean, obviously, if you've got thousands of animals in a building, there's going to be a lot of runoff that goes into a sewage pond or something. But I also understand that gets then trucked to a field someplace and sprayed. I mean, just sprayed onto the field.
Yeah.
What's the logic behind that?
Well, the general logic is that these are nutrients. This waste is nutritionally beneficial to the land, and there's several arguments to be made regarding that. First off, in a typical situation, if a cow were to poop in the middle of a prairie, you would have dung beetles that break down that poop and disperse it to the rest of that ecosystem. And there's a natural process for that feces becoming a nutrient. But in this case, when the waste has been sitting in an anaerobic lagoon, anaerobic meaning it has no access to oxygen whatsoever, it's not in a state where a natural ecosystem wants to break it down. Are there nutrients within this feces that help plants to grow? There are. If you're somebody who knows a little bit about growing, you would know that it's likely high in nitrogen, which isn't necessarily a good thing. It means you're going to get some good green growth out of your plants, but it also means you might end up with some massive pest issues with whatever you're growing off of that, because you have an excess amount of nitrogen, and that's another issue. There's a lot of nitrate poisoning that comes off of this, and even the legal limits of nitrate levels have been found to be too high in terms of what the legal limits should be. I think the legal limit for nitrates is like 10 parts per billion, and I think there's been studies that shown that even a quarter of that at low doses in humans can cause birth defects and can cause cancers and other issues. So, we are talking about an issue that needs to be addressed.
Exactly. It sounds like a fairly massive health issue for those around the CAFOs.
Yes.
We actually, on the Missouri side here in our listener area, we actually had a CAFO going in 2018 that was posted. It was going in near Powell Gardens. So the local DNR, Department of Natural Resources, issued the permit to, I think it was Valley Oak State Company. They had 900 head of cattle on a 400-acre ranch, and this permit would allow them to increase that to 6,999 head of cattle within a CAFO configuration. Odd number there, but I understand if they'd actually gone to 7,000, then they'd have a little bit more oversight. So, they opt that one cow less, so nobody can control their waste. Anyway, that was going in near Powell Gardens, which, is a large, area supported by the Powell Family Foundation and the Kauffman Foundation. So it had a lot of influence, and it was able to block that. It was able to get a stay on the permit, and then eventually Valley Oak States just shut down the farm and left. It was just more trouble for them. But I don't think anybody doubts that if this hadn't been near Powell Gardens, if it hadn't had the, Powell Family Foundation and all these other groups standing up and fighting this, nobody doubts that that CAFO would be running today. Do you find that CAFOs, I don't think prey on's the right word, but they disproportionately impact the poor and at-risk communities?
Absolutely. I mean, they prey on those who are least likely to raise a stink about it. No pun intended. But they specifically go after communities that are not likely to fight the issue at a county level or at a state level. And there's been a lot of examples of communities like the ones you just spoke about that have done amazing things in getting those operations to cease. And all that happens is they tend to just find another community that they can disenfranchise. So, and it's the same story with a lot of polluting industries. It's the same story, with people who are affected by living by a landfill. And landfills are generally sited in poor neighborhoods, oftentimes minority neighborhoods, and that's absolutely the case here with with what happens with these CAFOs.
It's very similar to landfills. I can see that parallel. Your film was screened recently as part of the Kansas City 2021 Earth Festival. I spoke with somebody who'd seen your film there, and they were actually shocked. They had no idea if CAFOs existed. This was entirely new information to them. And that kind of surprised me because I've been aware of this issue for a number of years. But for them, this was totally new. And they're like, oh my God, what should we do about this? We need to all stand up and act.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that there are still a lot of people out there who don't know about factory farming?
I think, unfortunately, there's a great deal of the American public that doesn't really want to know all there is to know about where their food is coming from. And there's a lot of dirty secrets in agriculture. I think on the animal agriculture side, there's more dirty secrets than there is on the vegetable side. And there's a lot of really horrible things that if you were to start looking into it, that one would learn. Thankfully, there are ethical ways to source meats. You can know your farmer. Especially in Missouri. When I went and visited, I was in Springfield, Missouri, and I felt I had the pick of the litter in terms of finding small farm operations where I could source pasture-raised meats or chicken or pork. And it's not that hard. It is going to cost a little bit extra, but you have to understand as a consumer that those animals are actually getting a lot more nutrition than what's being provided in these industrial systems, which is the cheapest of the cheap. I think they would, a grower in the industrial system will say that we are feeding our animals the best feed we possibly can, when all they're doing is feeding their animals the cheapest feed they possibly can. Right. So it's not the best. And animals that are raised on pasture have access to a lot more nutrition, and that nutrition is passed on to us humans when we eat it. And there's a plethora of other issues that we don't even talk about in Right to Harm, like antibiotic use. There's just an incredible amount of antibiotic use in the CAFO systems because antibiotics actually increase growth of animals. So they use it as a supplement, so that they can actually feed the animals less and save money that way. And the antibiotics are also necessary because when you crowd 60,000 chickens into one barn, they're likely to get sick. It's like now
Absolutely.
Here we are in COVID. If everyone were to gather in stadiums again, you're more likely to catch COVID going into a facility with a lot of people. Same thing with a chicken. So if a chicken's hanging around with a bunch of other chickens, it's more likely to get sick. So low doses of antibiotics in the food supply has caused antibiotic resistance. And that's a whole nother issue on top of what we discussed in Right to Harm.
So, I mean, within the CAFOs, that's kind of a breeding ground, not only for the animal disease, but those novel viruses that then migrate into humans,
Yeah,
the
there
influenzas and COVIDs and such.
There was really no hospitalization of people from outbreaks of Salmonella and E. coli prior to the late 70s, early 80s. It's not to say that wasn't happening, But what it is to say is that the introduction of the use of tetracycline and penicillin for animal husbandry in the 1950s led to resistance of those drugs being usable for humans to treat things such as Salmonella and E. coli. So now we have that problem on our hand from this. So just from a plethora of different angles, no matter how you look at it, whether you're looking at it from an environmental injustice lens, which is how we look at it in Right to Harm, or you're looking at it from an animal welfare standpoint or something else, there's lots of reasons why the system that is currently needs to change.
You've produced a number of award-winning films, and looking at your bio, you're primarily an urbanite, a city boy. What got you interested in farming?
I have this dream. My wife Annie, she produced and directed the film with me, and she's the one who really got me into food and eating really amazing food. Um, and honestly, we've had this dream of retiring to a farm one day and growing our own food, and doing a little bit of a homestead kind of thing. And it's really scary to think that you can go buy your dream property out there of however many acres and try to live a peaceful life, and then the next thing you know, a CAFO moves in across the street or even down the road, and every day you're smelling manure, and the most rancid manure smell. It's not a sweeter, like horse manure smell that someone might be accustomed to when riding horses. It is a putrid smell that causes a person to fall into deep depression, um, some real major issues. And actually this interview happening right now is incredibly timely because unfortunately one of the subjects in Right to Harm actually just passed away this past week. Her name's Elsie Herring, and she was one of the people we featured in North Carolina. And Elsie was in a lifelong battle with her neighbors, who were spraying hog feces 8 feet from her house. And she was in the middle of a nuisance lawsuit that would have paid her something for the nuisances that this caused her. She never got to experience kind of that that sanctity of living on a farm in peace. She died before that happened, and to me that was really sad that she never really had a chance to experience life the way she'd wanted to experience it, and in large part because of the CAFOs that are around her.
Yeah, that's truly tragic, and I'm so sorry to hear that for Elsie and her family. Um, I mean, my family for generations back have been northern Missouri, Iowa farmers. So I mean, I understand that entire small farm. I mean, I grew up on small farms. I know what that's like, and so many of them have lost their farms to the corporations that are buying that all up, conglomerating the land for crop raising. But then this CAFO is kind of a new layer on top of that. It's something that I only became aware of a few years ago, but it seems to be becoming increasingly a problem. It really does.
Yeah, I mean, the problem has really been increasing because the main companies that are in charge of the global market are looking at the United States as a place that produces pork for the world, or a place that produces chickens for the world, and even beef. And because it's been commoditized at the global level, it doesn't matter what U.S. Consuming rates are, of these products. It matters more what in total what people across the world
The
are
international
eating.
markets, yeah.
So even if we were to start to think about eating less of this here in the United States, we really have to think about the fact that a lot of this isn't being grown or raised for consumers in the United States. Also, a lot of it's not even owned by U.S. companies. A lot of it's owned by Chinese companies or other companies. So, that's another issue in itself.
And
that
just
needs
in
to
the
be
broader
addressed.
sense of climate change and such, I mean, we're transporting these foods across the world, which is burning fossil
Right,
fuels. And I
right,
mean, it's all interconnected.
right. And to the point you were making, it, about being raised on a farm, and it's really a shame because in the 1930s we had over 6 million farms in the United States that were contributing to the food supply. We have less than 2 million now. So all we've done is consolidated farming in general. And the horrible thing about that is that farming is a very peaceful way to live. And we've taken that ability to live a peaceful life, to take care of the land, to be a steward to the land, and we've made it into we've commoditized it and standardized it and made it into something that it isn't sanctimonious to a person really at all. It isn't something that puts a person in a peaceful place. So I do hope we can get back to the point where more people are contributing to the food system in the United States. Because right now things are just way too consolidated.
Has this changed or postponed your dream of becoming farmers?
It's, I mean, it's the dream of becoming a farmer obviously is about acquiring land, and land is very expensive. I'll say that. So I mean, that's probably the largest bottleneck for me personally is acquiring land. I think the main thing is I want to know that wherever I'm going to move, there isn't going to be a CAFO that moves within a half mile of me at some point in time and ruins my way of life,
Investment.
ruins my investment, my property value. The studies have shown that property values fall 33% for if you live within 2 miles of a CAFO. So there's a better way to do this, and there's a more there's and not just for the animals or for those who live around it, but for the ecosystems that we need to create to farm. It's important. Using regenerative rotational grazing as an alternative to CAFOs is a way to sequester carbon. It's a way to increase biodiversity. It's a way to sequester water. Right now, we're in the middle of a horrible drought in the Midwest. I don't know how much it's rained in Missouri, but in Chicago, normally it would be very wet this time of year. And it's dry, very dry. I think it's the 6th driest spring on record. So it doesn't help when half of the land in the Midwest is being used to grow animal feed year over year in an annual crop growth, where the soil is barren for the spring, and you don't get enough water, then the farmers are pretty much screwed. So I'll be interested to see how that all pans out with row crop farmers this year, to see if they're able to have enough water, or if there's, I know there's massive droughts happening all across the country.
Right. KKFI, we interviewed your co-director, Annie, in 2019 when your film came out. So, it's been a little over 2 years ago. What changes have you seen, both in interest in your film and in the environment?
We've seen a lot of wins, actually. I guess if you're on the side of fighting the CAFOs, we've seen more wins lately. We've seen people growing to dislike the way animal agriculture is, and I think it's important to remember that the form of agriculture, the form of animal agriculture that we use here in the United States is not something that was developed thousands of years ago. It was something that it was only developed in like the 1960s and 70s was when it became really popular. That's not really all that long ago. And I hope the industry can look at this as just a time period in the totality of learning about agriculture. And I think we'll get to a point at sometime soon, hopefully, where we can collectively say this was a mistake. This was when we did it, when we decided to have these CAFOs, it seemed logical because people were starving at the time. We needed to feed mouths around the world. And now we know that that's not necessary. It's not necessary to crowd animals in buildings in order to do that. There are other ways to do it. We also know that animal meats is not the only source of protein and nutrients in a person's diet. So it doesn't need to be, we can supplement with other things that can be grown. So I think generally speaking, there's a greater awareness of people wanting to know where their meats are sourced. There's a greater awareness of the need for animals to be on pasture, to have an ethical sourcing, ethical transparency in the supply chain for how meat ended up on your plate for dinner. I think that's a growing trend. I think one thing I would like to personally see is I'd like to see people understand that it's going to cost more to eat this, and it should cost more because to grow a 4-pound bird and to sell it for $5 doesn't work out unless there are government subsidies involved, which there are currently for that, but there are none for those who are raising their birds on pasture. So there's lots of inequalities in that aspect of it too. But if meat costs more and vegetables cost less, and we eat less meat, we eat more vegetables, I don't think that would be such a bad thing. Doesn't mean we have to give up animals altogether in terms of our diet, but I think,
Right.
It'd go a long way. If you look at the history of meat consumption in the United States, it's almost always been twice the recommended average. So there's some improvements that can be made there.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your film?
And for more information on the film, you can go to righttoharm.film, and the film is available on Vimeo on demand, either for purchase or for rent. And we have a plethora of ways people can take action and kind of be part of this growing movement to inform themselves and others about the issues involving CAFOs.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank our KKFI listeners. This has been Radioactive Magazine. I'm your host, Bob Grove.